Jung's most troubling observation wasn't about archetypes or dreams. It was about individuals who perceive invisible truths in every interaction, and why this capacity systematically destroys their lives. In his decades of clinical work, Jung encountered patients possessing what he termed heightened symbolic perception. People who could detect unspoken intentions, sense psychological undercurrents, and recognize behavioral patterns that remained completely invisible to others. They perceived the hidden architecture beneath social interactions, felt emotional shifts before they surfaced, and saw the contradictions people carried but never acknowledged. Jung labeled this observation troubling because these individuals uniformly experienced profound alienation, chronic exhaustion, and an inability to sustain conventional relationships. Not due to mental instability, but because this level of awareness extracted a price that modern psychology still fails to comprehend. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most troubling observation about people who perceive invisible truths and why he concluded this unusual capacity either annihilates you or elevates you into something humanity desperately needs. The discovery that unveiled Jung's most troubling observation started with a woman he referenced in his correspondence from 1917 during the height of World War I, when Jung was developing his theory of psychological types. This patient, embodying what Jung would eventually classify as the introverted thinking intuitive, demonstrated what he called penetrative psychological vision. She could enter any social situation and immediately perceive the hidden dynamics. Which person was performing a false identity? Which relationship was sustained by unspoken resentments? Which family harbored secrets that poisoned every interaction? Jung documented in his private case notes, the patient demonstrates an unusual facility for detecting psychological structures that others cannot perceive. Yet this capability appears to generate profound suffering rather than any discernible benefit. She couldn't participate in ordinary conversation because she perceived the performances beneath every exchange. She couldn't sustain intimate relationships because people felt psychologically naked and defensive in her presence. She couldn't maintain professional positions because her awareness disrupted the unconscious agreements that allow organizations to function smoothly. Jung recognized he wasn't observing illness. He was witnessing what occurs when consciousness becomes too developed for social integration, when perception becomes too refined for collective survival. He recorded her descriptions of others with disturbing precision. She discusses individuals as though she possesses direct access to their inner psychological landscape and concealed motivations. When I investigate her assessments through subsequent inquiry, they demonstrate remarkable validity. This wasn't delusion or fantasy. This was awareness so evolved it had become socially catastrophic. But Jung discovered something far more disturbing, because this patient's unusual perception appeared impossible to rationalize. Therefore, Jung began exploring what he termed psychic contagion, the psychological mechanism where individuals with exceptionally refined intuition become flooded by unconscious material from their environment. Jung wrote during his Red Book period, certain individuals exist whose psychological sensitivity operates at such intensity that they absorb not simply conscious communications, but the complete unconscious atmosphere surrounding them. Contemporary neuroscience research by Dr. Judith Orloff on empathic sensitivity confirms Jung's early findings. Her work demonstrates that approximately 15 to 20% of the population possesses heightened neurological sensitivity to emotional and social stimuli. But Jung identified something more precise within his framework of psychological type. The introverted intuitive thinking type, representing perhaps 1 to 2% of the population, who don't merely experience emotions deeply but perceive structural patterns in the unconscious with startling accuracy. Jung noted these individuals possess what he called developed intuitive perception. Their consciousness processes not just surface-level social signals, but unconscious emotional architectures, repressed psychological material, and behavioral patterns that escape normal detection. They perceive the anxiety beneath polished confidence. They sense the desperation inside controlled presentations. They detect the collective shadow that groups unconsciously collaborate to ignore. Jung wrote, "The peril exists not in perception itself, but in the psychological exile it generates. When one perceives clearly what others cannot or refuse to perceive, one becomes a reflection that collective consciousness cannot tolerate. This creates what Jung termed the superior function dilemma, when your most developed capacity becomes your heaviest burden because it exiles you from collective psychological participation. But Jung discovered the actual danger wasn't the perception itself, because individuals with exceptionally developed perception see others' unconscious material clearly. Therefore, they become magnets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously assault them for reflecting what they refuse to recognize in themselves. Jung wrote in his essays on analytical psychology, "Nothing exerts a more powerful psychological influence on the environment, and particularly on children, than the unlived life of the parents." But he discovered this principle extended throughout all human relationships. When someone's shadow gets reflected through another person's clear perception, the unconscious psyche faces two options: integrate the shadow material or destroy the reflection. Jung documented this pattern consistently throughout his practice. The person who perceives clearly becomes blamed for generating the problems they're simply observing. His patients with developed intuition experienced this relentlessly. When they would carefully suggest someone appeared distressed, that person would rage at them for spreading negativity or manufacturing conflict. When they'd voice concern about evident problems, they'd face accusations of being hypercritical or inventing issues from nothing. Jung realized this wasn't random. It was psychological necessity. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Everything that provokes us about others provides a pathway to understanding ourselves." But for most individuals, it proves infinitely easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being revealed. This generates what Jung called the designated patient phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals frequently become identified as the problem source in every system they inhabit, not because they create dysfunction, but because they reveal dysfunction that already exists in the collective unconscious structure. Jung observed, "The carrier of superior perception becomes the container for everything the collective cannot consciously acknowledge about its own nature." This pattern explains why these individuals don't simply feel misunderstood. They experience systematic targeting by forces they cannot rationally comprehend. But Jung's most disturbing observation was still emerging, because Jung observed that exceptional perception manifested differently across individuals. Therefore, he identified 4 distinct expressions within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different method of processing unconscious material from the environment. Pattern 1, the emotional absorber. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with highly developed feeling capacity. These individuals don't just perceive what's occurring psychologically, they experience it somatically in their own physical bodies. They absorb others' emotional states so thoroughly they frequently cannot distinguish between their authentic feelings and what they've unconsciously absorbed from their surroundings. Jung wrote, "The emotional absorber exists in perpetual affective contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone within their psychological radius." Pattern 2, the pattern synthesizer. These individuals perceive psychological structures and forecast behavioral outcomes with uncanny precision. Jung observed they could predict relationship collapses, professional failures, and personal crises months before manifestation, not through analytical reasoning, but through unconscious pattern recognition that operates beneath awareness. Jung noted, "They possess an extraordinary capacity to perceive the inevitable conclusions of unconscious processes that remain invisible to others." Pattern 3, the somatic detector. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical expressions of psychological conditions in others, identifying illness before clinical symptoms appeared, detecting exhaustion before conscious acknowledgement, or sensing the bodily tension indicating emotional distress beneath composed exteriors. Jung wrote, "These individuals function as early detection systems for psychological and physiological disease within their environment." Pattern 4, the pure perceiver. The rarest expression Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he termed undeveloped auxiliary functions. They perceived everything but struggled to organize or articulate their perceptions coherently. Jung observed, They inhabit a condition of continuous overwhelm, receiving enormous quantities of unconscious information without sufficient psychological architecture to process it productively. Understanding your specific pattern proves essential because each expression requires different approaches to what Jung called the containment challenge. But first, you must understand why Jung considered this observation so troubling. Because Jung witnessed the devastating consequences of uncontained perception on his patients. Therefore, he determined that perceiving everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine threats to both individual and collective psychological health. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this observation so concerning. Danger 1, collective agreement violation. Jung wrote, "The individual who perceives with excessive clarity threatens the collective agreements upon which social stability depends." When someone sees through the shared illusions holding groups together, the unspoken contracts to ignore particular truths, they become a destabilizing element. Jung observed that families, organizations, and societies function partially through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The exceptionally perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2, existential exile. Jung documented how developed perception creates what he termed the curse of consciousness. When your most advanced psychological capacity becomes the source of your deepest suffering, he wrote, "The burden of awareness is that it cannot be transmitted to those who lack the capacity to receive it. The individual becomes isolated consciousness in an ocean of collective unconsciousness. This isolation isn't merely social loneliness, it's existential alienation. These individuals consistently report experiencing reality itself differently from everyone surrounding them." Danger 3, psychological dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb unconscious material from others frequently lose contact with their own authentic core identity. They become so saturated with external psychological content that they cannot distinguish between their genuine inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this psychic infection a condition where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious material. He wrote, "The danger transcends social isolation. It approaches psychological annihilation, the complete dissolution of individual identity into collective possession." This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not merely therapeutically beneficial, but psychologically urgent. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, therefore, Jung developed what he called active individuation, a systematic methodology for maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious material. Stage 1, psychological discrimination. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological content that wasn't authentically their own. He called this conscious boundary awareness, the capacity to distinguish between genuine inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external material. Jung wrote, "The primary task involves establishing what belongs to your psyche and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, individual development becomes impossible." The technique Jung prescribed involved daily periods of complete isolation, allowing absorbed material to settle so patients could recognize their own authentic psychological signal beneath the noise. Stage 2, personal shadow work. Jung discovered that people who perceive others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own shadow material. The more you deny your own capacity for manipulation, cruelty, or dishonesty, the more disturbed you'll become by perceiving these qualities in others. Jung wrote, "Everything that disturbs us about others provides a pathway to self-understanding, but only if we possess sufficient courage to direct attention inward rather than remaining fixated outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you defective, it makes you psychologically complete, capable of perceiving clearly without reactive judgment." Stage 3, conscious engagement. The final stage involves what Jung termed conscious participation in the collective. the capacity to engage with others' psychological material without being overwhelmed or losing individual identity. Jung wrote, "The individuated person functions as a bridge between conscious and unconscious realms, helping to make unconscious content conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological capacity, the ability to temporarily hold others' unconscious material while maintaining awareness that it is not your own content." Because Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals. Therefore, he studied historical figures to understand the distinction between successful integration and psychological breakdown. The case of Dostoevsky, Integrated Perception. Jung extensively analyzed Fyodor Dostoevsky, whom he considered a masterful example of integrated superior perception. Dostoevsky possessed what Jung called penetrative psychological intuition, the capacity to perceive the darkest aspects of human nature with unflinching clarity. But unlike many with this gift, Dostoevsky channeled his perception into creative transformation. Jung wrote, "Dostoevsky transformed his overwhelming perception into literary art that could illuminate psychological truth without destroying readers. He perceived darkness clearly, but created containers that allowed others to encounter it gradually." Jung noted that Dostoevsky's success emerged from what he termed creative sublimation, transforming raw perception into structured art that served collective consciousness evolution. The case of Van Gogh, Unintegrated Perception. Jung also studied Vincent van Gogh, whom he saw as representing what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. Van Gogh possessed extraordinary perceptual sensitivity, seeing colors, patterns, and emotional resonances that others couldn't detect. Jung wrote, "Van Gogh's perception was so overwhelming, so uncontained by psychological structure, that it eventually consumed him. He could see everything but lacked the psychological framework to metabolize what he perceived." Jung observed that Van Gogh's tragedy illustrated what occurs when perception exceeds integration capacity. The individual becomes devoured by what they see rather than transformed by it. Jung's own integration journey. Most significantly, Jung documented his personal struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in his Red Book. Jung wrote, "I was threatened by psychological disintegration and preserved only through my capacity to understand what was occurring through my clinical work with patients. His superior perception of unconscious material, both personal and collective, nearly destroyed him until he learned to consciously integrate these experiences." Jung's breakthrough came when he realized his overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to develop beyond current collective limitations. This realization transformed his approach to patients with similar capacities, because individuals with superior perception often face isolation. Therefore, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of locating what he called conscious witnesses, others capable of engaging with developed consciousness without defensiveness. Jung wrote in his essay on the development of personality, "The supreme privilege is becoming who you authentically are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity." Jung identified 3 essential relationship types for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1, fellow individuated persons. Jung wrote, "The individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There exists a quality of authentic presence that cannot be manufactured. These connections often occur instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious collective. These relationships prove rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can exist completely authentically without fear of overwhelming or threatening them." Type 2, active individuators. Jung observed that people actively engaged in their own individuation process, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice, can often engage with superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. Jung wrote, "Those who have begun knowing themselves can bear being known by others." Type 3, natural containers. Jung identified individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what he called natural holding capacity, the ability to contain psychological material without being destabilized by it. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges and developed psychological resilience. The recognition process. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately becoming defensive. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, authentic interest in inner reality. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and personal development, gradual-revelation protocol. Jung taught a careful process for revealing perceptive capacities. Begin with small, gentle observations. Notice their response pattern to feedback. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. Jung emphasized, the goal isn't finding people who accept everything you perceive, but finding people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions rather than threats to their self-concept. Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development. Therefore, Jung viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being, but for human consciousness evolution itself. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The individual has always been the vehicle of the living spirit, the one who catalyzes change in collective consciousness." He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he termed consciousness catalysts, people who help awareness evolve. The 4 transformation stages. Stage 1, recognition without devastation. The first transformation occurs when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive capacities without being crushed by them. Jung called this conscious acceptance of developed function. Jung wrote, "Wisdom begins with recognizing what one actually is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be." Stage 2, integration without exile. The second stage involves learning to use perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Jung called this integrated individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. Jung observed, the individuated person doesn't withdraw from the world, but engages with it more consciously. Stage 3, service without depletion. The third transformation happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer rather than a burden you carry. Jung called this conscious contribution, using your capacities in service of others without depleting yourself. Jung wrote, "The supreme privilege is becoming who you truly are and then offering that authentic self in service of the collective." Stage 4, legacy without attachment. The final stage involves what Jung called transcendent function, using your perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. Jung observed, the individuated person works for future consciousness evolution, not for personal recognition in the present. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They perceive what collective consciousness isn't yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Jung wrote, "What remains unconscious manifests as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who master integration help make unconscious material conscious before it manifests destructively in collective behavior. Because the path of integrating superior perception contains specific dangers." Therefore, Jung documented the most common ways individuals derail their own transformation process. Pitfall 1, messianic inflation. Jung wrote extensively about psychological inflation, when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. He warned, "The danger is that ego identifies with the archetype, leading to inflation that severs the individual from authentic human relationships. Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what Jung called the savior complex, believing they must rescue everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching, judgment, and eventual isolation. Jung observed, the moment one believes oneself the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand. Pitfall 2. Superior withdrawal. Jung documented cases where individuals used their superior perception to justify complete withdrawal from collective life. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to merit engagement, which Jung recognized as spiritual superiority masquerading as wisdom. Jung wrote, "Authentic individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life hasn't transcended it, but has been defeated by it." Pitfall 3. Helper identity fusion. Jung observed that some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their capacity to see and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Jung warned, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This isn't individuation, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role. Pitfall 4. Regression under stress. Even successfully integrated individuals can regress during periods of stress, trauma, or major life transitions. They stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and become flooded with others' unconscious material again. Jung emphasized, integration isn't a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological contents from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious material. Connection with others capable of providing reality checking and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Jung wrote, "The integrated person doesn't achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity." Because Jung understood superior perception within the context of collective psychological development. Therefore, he viewed highly perceptive individuals as serving an essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about change in society." He believed that people with superior perception serve as what he called developmental scouts, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness, a historical pattern. Jung observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to integrate their insights. They served as advanced scouts for psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. Jung wrote, "What appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for consciousness experiments that will eventually benefit the whole." Modern implications. Jung believed that in the modern era, highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns, explaining collective behavior, social and environmental unsustainability before it becomes obvious, spiritual possibilities beyond current religious frameworks, technological implications others haven't considered, collective shadow material requiring conscious integration. Jung's insight was clear. The sensitive individual experiences collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. Service without martyrdom. Jung's crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't becoming a martyr to consciousness, but becoming a bridge between what is and what's becoming. Jung wrote, "The individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole." At the highest level of development, Jung observed individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity to serve consciousness evolution naturally without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember Jung's patient from 1917, the introverted thinking intuitive who came to him during World War I. After 4 years of working with Jung's individuation process, her life transformed fundamentally. She learned to distinguish between her own psychological material and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a psychological consultant where her developed perception helped organizations understand hidden dynamics. She built relationships with people who valued her insights rather than fearing them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a capacity requiring conscious development. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to perceive less, but to perceive more wisely, not to see less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most troubling observation, that certain individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds collective readiness, and this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation and overwhelm, or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological design. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you perceive everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of collective development. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You were born to perceive everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness catalysts preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable, but not yet obvious. Jung's most troubling observation wasn't that some people perceive everything. It's that most people who perceive everything never learn to use what they perceive wisely. The danger isn't in the perception itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as Jung learned to wield his, the danger of seeing what others don't isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the highly perceptive individual, you're part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which pattern of perception you recognize in yourself. Your individuation journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends collective unconscious limitation. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.